Hello and welcome back to another episode of Fully Booked, the Hidden Gems author podcast, in which Craig Touch and myself, Roland Hume, chat to some interesting figures and leading lights of this crazy industry we're in of writing and self-publishing. And today we are delighted to have a very special guest, Lynne Golodner, author of 9 books, a coach and entrepreneur. Did I get your last name right that time?
You did. That was great. Thank you so much.
Lynne, we are delighted to have you here to talk about characterization, which is one of my favorite topics. So thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Really appreciate being here. And, I love talking about all the nuances of story. So this is going to be fun.
Excellent. Well, we are very, very excited to hear from you. And of course, we wouldn't be here without the man himself, Craig Touch, the owner and founder of Hidden Gems and an author himself. How are you doing today, Craig?
Doing great. Thanks, Roland. Thank you, Lynn, for joining us. The idea, we have talked a little bit about it in the past, but you can never really talk about character development enough, I don't think, because it's so central to writing fiction, right? You have 9 books, but I saw you had your first novel was September 26, 2023, right? So was it nonfiction that was before that?
So I had 2 collections of poetry and then 6 nonfiction books, and then Woman of Valor, my novel that came out in September.
Right. And then in some of your nonfiction is where you've been writing about had compelling characters, finding your voice, stuff like that, right? So where did you sort of pick up all your knowledge of characterization from, since you were writing, poetry and nonfiction ahead of writing your actual novel?
So it's interesting because my novel came out in September, but that doesn't mean it was the first one that I wrote. So I actually wrote a novel in 2000. So we're talking like 23 years ago. And I've been trying to do fiction well for a long time. And I think it took me this many years to get there. But, my training is in undergraduate. I studied journalism and then and literature. And then I did an MFA in creative writing. And so I've been studying writing and characterization and the elements of craft my whole life. And I've been not only taking classes, but I've been teaching writing at the university level and then teaching adults now for about 25 years. And so I sort of pick apart how writing happens in a variety of contexts. And I do think that my early work in journalism, where I'm actually dealing with real characters, real people and interviews and watching settings unfold and taking notes on it and just sort of being an observer of human nature, was sort of an organic on the spot type of way to learn, as well as all of my academic training too. So when I teach now, and I teach a lot of writing classes, I talk about how character development matters, not just for fiction, but even in nonfiction, even when you're writing a memoir and it's about real people in your life. I think it's harder, but you still have to think of them as characters and figure out what's their motivation, what are the nuances of their personalities, you have them be multifaceted, which is really hard when it's somebody but you know them from the outside. Whereas fiction, you're creating them from scratch. And so you can be inside, outside, all views.
That's so interesting. I was just thinking if some of the best writers in the world had a journalism background. I mean, I mentioned in every single podcast, Ian Fleming, journalist. Ernest Hemingway was a writer and reporter. And I think part of what you say, when you create characters, as of having a journalistic background, you observe, don't you?
Yeah.
You observe without judgment and write about what it is they do. Whereas I think it's very easy as an author, you create these characters. And so you almost like use them like puppets, whereas people aren't like that. People do things based on their motivations, not based on what the invisible writer is making them do.
Yeah, 100%. I actually teach a course on writing like Hemingway, which is really focusing on the art of the sentence. But, so much of what Hemingway did was tell the story with what wasn't shared. So it's the deliberate inclusion or exclusion of things, like just really paring down so that it's only what's necessary to tell that story well,
The iceberg method, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. It's exactly what it is. And I actually just taught it a couple of weeks ago. So it's like fresh in my mind. But I think that being a journalist really has helped me in all genres. And in fact, when I've written poetry, my friends will say, oh, it's so, reported. There's so many facts in here. And then, of course, when I write journalism or fiction, they're like, oh, yeah, it's so lyrical. It's poetic. Because I think the genres bleed. And so you sort of take all that and you pour it into whatever you're writing. But when it comes to characters, I think observation of actual humans is the best teacher. And, I think it makes it easier to have that objective perspective and sort of the bird's eye view of your characters. I will say, when I write nonfiction, and I do write creative nonfiction essays all the time, I have to be so careful not to have my own biased perspective on the people who were actually part of an event or the family or whatever, because we just don't have that perspective that we need when we're creating characters. And so it's important to bring those fiction sensibilities into the writing of nonfiction too.
That's really interesting as well. I just read a biography of Winston Churchill. He's quite a controversial figure, and it was written by a former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who was a big fan of Churchill. But then again, he had to stop and be like, okay, I like Churchill, and I kind of like want to project my values onto him. But
Right.
He's a real person who did these things, and it's like, he did good things, he did bad things. How can you observe? How can both coexist in the same place? And with real people, they are often contradictions. And I think the best fictional characters are also contradictions. They can be both good and evil.
Yes, 100%. When you're writing a character, you have to think about, well, why are they doing this? And what are their relationships on the page, but also the relationships you never are going to see in the story. So, you have to think of them as multifaceted, three-dimensional people who exist outside of the book so that they can do their job in the book. And I think one of the best things that I did, so, I just had a novel come out, but then I just finished my next novel, which is going to come out next year. And I learned from the first novel to not be a pantser, because that's what I did. And it was so hard to keep track of everything. So for this next novel, I spent a month planning it out. And that included character development for each of the characters and like lengthy character sketches. And I kept a printed version on the desk next to me when I was writing. And as the characters started to speak to me, as they will do in fiction writing, I had to just make notes and change those details so that they still had the depth of character that I had envisioned. They just got deeper or bigger, based on how they showed up. So I think it's super important to know those characters before you even begin to write them.
Yeah. And where do characters come from? Gore Vidal wrote that a good writer has like 12 actors in his troupe, and these are like 12 characters you have, and it's almost like every single book you write, you take those 12 characters and recast them. And I kind of find that it's like there are people in my real life who I'm like, okay, I need this person. You almost like take them lock, stop, and put them in there and change your names, because that means in your head you know how they'll react to certain things. And I don't know. Where you come with your characters, where you invent them, come up with them.
I absolutely love that. I think that is so brilliant. And you're probably right. Now I'm going to get off this interview and I'm going to think about the people in my life and see like what tropes keep showing up again and again, but it's true in books. I mean, I find that there's a similar, I guess, cadence to the story with each one, even though the landscape may be different, or the year, or the details of the story. But like, I write really compelling stories. Well, I think they're compelling, but compelling characters who are who grapple with identity. So like Woman of Valor is a very religious book, and it's one main character, one POV. And it's somebody who's in the Orthodox Jewish world, and it's how she determines her identity. But she has a best friend. She has a husband. She has 3 kids. She has, sort of the foes in the community as well. She has the stalker ex-boyfriend who shows up, and all these things that happen. And then, in the next book, there's 4 main characters, 4 POV, but I think it's the same thing. Like there's a great love, a great romance in there. There's grappling with identity. So the same types of things I think come up in our stories again and again, because it's what we're fascinated with and how we're trying to answer these questions. We don't quite ever get there. So we just keep trying in the next book,
I like that. I like that a lot. And it's not really reusing characters. Like Stephen King, for example, some of the most compelling characters he comes up with, the real monsters are never the monsters. They're the people. Like in It, for example, there's I can't remember her name, the one female member of the group, and her abusive father, who's just like a vile, horrible person. And it's like he's the real monster, but he's a character who's real. And then he kind of repeats this through all his books. That's one of the themes, just like you were talking about, the themes of trying to find your identity. And I think maybe that's why readers gravitate to an author, because maybe they are looking for the same answers to the question that the author is looking for.
You would think, and I think that's really wise. It's why we keep going back to the favorite authors we have again and again, and whenever they put out something new, we want to scoop it up right away. And I will say that as a marketing expert myself, it's really smart to do that. You know, I like to challenge myself as a writer and try new things and come up with new stories. But at the end of the day, if somebody likes one of my books and they want to see the same type of experience again and again, then it's not a bad thing that I'm revisiting the tropes and the character development and the, you know, the questions that I seek to answer in the stories. That's how you make money as an author, is by doing something well and doing it in a lot of different forms again and again and again.
Yeah, I mean, we are at the end of the day making products, and it's like Fast and Furious. You know, you might like those movies or hate those movies, but they have an audience who loves them, and there's like, I want the cars, I want the fist fights, I want to talk about the families, and you need to have that to be satisfying.
Yeah, no, it's so true. Go ahead.
You need to hone in on what it is about your story that the people are connecting to, and give them more of the same, but still different enough that they're not like, okay, well, the second book is very much similar to the first, right? Which is sometimes what happens in a Fast and the Furious movie. You know, sometimes you'll see one of the movies that come out and they say, it's all the same, right? But the ones that do better are the ones that sort of push the envelope enough that it's still a better new movie, but it still maintains those things that everyone loves about it. And often that is the continuity of characters within the movie. And in a lot of books, that's also the thing. You keep those characters and you still keep sort of growing them, but you put them in a new setting with a new adventure or whatever, right? Especially within genre fiction, if you're writing a series, people come back often for the characters.
Oh yeah,
because the story itself moves along, but the characters, you know, they grow, but there's still the core of them are still the same. You still know that this person is this kind of person and this person is that kind of person, right? I think that's really what people gravitate to most, is characters over story.
Yeah, well, actually, there's a great example of that. And I know this sounds really cheesy, but I do like the Outlander series of books. And I think they're just beautifully written and adventurous, and there's so much. But ultimately, at the end of the day, people come back for Jamie and Claire, for their love story, for their, you know, and to see if they're pulled apart, because they're always pulled apart. How are they going to get back together? And so, you know, in the end, there's a lot of other things that happen, a lot of other characters, a lot of settings, but they come back for the two of them. And it's a really successful franchise. I mean, Harry Potter too. Look at Harry Potter. Same thing, you know, same characters, different day, but everybody's coming back to see what's going to happen.
Yeah. I mean, I think that works for a lot of the long running books. The Bones series by Kathy Reichs. And you know, there's the Will They Won't They that goes through book after book after book. Lee Child with Jack Reacher. It's like Jack Reacher is such a well-defined character. And it's like, you know that you're going to stick Jack Reacher into an interesting situation. You know how he's going to act. So you know you're going to enjoy the ride. And so you read them book after book after book.
Well, look at Louise Penny. I mean, her books are like, she has an audience around the world, and everybody is looking at, you know, it's the same exact type of mystery that happens each time, a detective crime story, but it's the same detective over and over again. And I think I don't even know how many books she has, but people are Louise Penny fanatics, and they just love it. And it's the same formula each time.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that, you know, what you're saying before, so you have the journalism background that's taught you to sort of dig deep into these characters, into people, and to understanding them, right? Different people have different ways that they do that. People pull from their own lives, the characters, the people in their own lives. A lot of authors talk about being people watchers. You know, they like to sit in their coffee shop and just watch people and see what they're doing, who they're interacting with, how they're acting, and they sort of sometimes they'll pull that into their stories. I took, in university, I went originally for creative writing, and I switched to psychology. And so I find that I use sort of that kind of the psychology background to sort of understand people, their motivations, and be able to sort of weave that into, you know, how I create characters. But, you know, what are some of the ways that authors that, you know, don't have necessarily some of that background, what are the ways that they can use to create compelling characters?
So I think that asking a lot of questions of your characters, like having those conversations with the characters to figure out why they do what they do, what they believe, you know, what's their background that brought them to this moment, is super important. And that can just be free writing, you know, just asking questions as if you're like speed dating with the character in some way, but getting to know them, trying to understand their motivation. But the reality is that even if you don't have training in journalism, just noticing, just sitting in a coffee shop, listening to conversations, watching people, taking notes about it is really helpful. And I think that, thinking about different situations we've been in, workplaces, classrooms, family gatherings. I mean, your family is the best source to mine for characters because you're going to have all kinds of personalities, some really quirky ones, and that's a lot of fun to play with. So I think that those observation skills can be really important. And I think research plays into this too. Even when I write about something that I know really well, there's still something I don't know. And so I have to like dig in and do the research and make it believable so that I fill in the blanks that I might have in my memory or my experience. And so, if you have an idea for a character, but it's not fully fleshed, then, doing some research to figure out more about this person can really help you to get there too.
Yeah, and I think when you're using family, you have to be careful too that they, you don't, if you make it a little too close, they might recognize themselves, and if it's not painted in exactly the best light, they might have a problem with it.
Well, I have to say, Craig, that what I say to my students in my writing classes is that there are going to always be people who swear that they see themselves in your writing and they're not there. And then the people who really are in the writing might actually never read it. And so, yes, you're right. But at the same time, you can't be so worried about it because it just doesn't work out that way. Like literally there's going to be that pesky cousin who's convinced that every bad guy in your book is based on them. And like, they're not even in your mind,
There may be those ones that it is based on them, but they're so oblivious to who they really are that they don't recognize themselves at all, right? It's like, oh, that person's a jerk. And you're like, yeah.
Well, it's funny. I have a friend who's written a bunch of novels, very successful. And she said it took her like several novels in before she realized she was always writing about these like horrible mothers. And she has a terrible relationship with her mother. She's like, oh, I didn't get it until like, the fourth novel in or something. But you sort of perpetuate what you know. I don't know if her mom reads her books or not, but like, yeah, it's sort of a little bit of therapy, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think we did an episode as writing as therapy, right? It's a lot of people do that. They sort of use writing to work through some of the feelings they have with the people in their lives or the things that they've gone through. And that's great because sometimes it can help other people that are going through those same things or have those same people in their lives. And so it's not just therapy for yourself, but almost for the people reading it.
Oh, 100%. I think that I always say to my students, if one person is changed or feels less alone or, whatever from something you wrote, then it was a success. But it is funny because a lot of people that I know who've been reading my novel are like, oh, I can see you in it. I'm like, it is fiction. It is not me. I was Orthodox in the Jewish world for 10 years, nothing like the character. So, I know something about the world, which gave me some information, but then I did a ton of research. So we want to see what we want to see. And we also block out what we don't want to see.
Yeah, for sure. I like too that you mentioned before that you went from being sort of a pantser to a plotter.
Yeah.
And with writing characters, a lot of the time that is important because you want to make sure you understand their motivations. And I'm definitely more on the plotter side. And we've talked to people that are more pantser side, and I get sort of that, but I think that it's important. Sometimes what a pantser, their arguments are the idea that you're sort of being blocked in and to the outline that you've made. You don't want to be constrained and this and that. But as you said, even with you, when you're pantsing, you're writing out these character bios. But if the character takes a different direction, as they often do, that doesn't mean you have to stick to it. You just go back and you revise your bio so that they're still consistent later on when you want to continue writing them. And I think that that's an important distinction, and that people have to realize that that's perfectly okay. And as if they're a plotter, you're allowed to change your notes, right? It's your story. So.
Yeah, I think it is really important. And I was curious when I decided to plot this next novel, I was wondering if the characters would still talk to me or if I would be too rigidly planned out. And so I was curious, and I was really glad when they did. And the story went in other directions. And so I just had to update, and print out a new version or, whatever. But I found that when I was pantsing, I would get stuck in what is known as the saggy middle because I didn't know where it was going. And also I couldn't keep track. Like, oh, well, what happened here? And who was that neighbor? What was the name I gave them? And I've done some developmental editing for clients, and I can always tell when somebody's pantsing and they haven't proofread what they sent me because, like, it's Susie for the first 25 pages and then it's Vivian for the next 25, and it's the same character. And I'm like, is Vivian Susie? And like, it's really, really hard. So I think that keeping track in some way, even if you're not going to actually plot it out, but you might have just a document where you make a little family tree or something just so you know who the characters are, is really important. But I do think that if you're immersed in the fiction, the characters are going to speak to you and they're going to take over the page, and that's the fun of it. And so you just let them, and then you make your edits, and it all works out. It really does.
I think that's the secret really to some of the best books. Especially I like reading a lot of romance, and to me the best romance books that I've written and read have been the ones where it's the characters have come along. I have a just quite common in romance, and I mentioned the same, where you have like a book that focuses on one couple, but there are other couples around. So the next book is on another couple, and the next book is another couple. And then what you find is, like, if you have these side characters and you have two of them that are very strongly fleshed out, and you're like, I wonder what would happen if I put this character and this character together. And if they're good characters, the book writes itself at that point, because you know how they'll both act. And if they have conflicts, you'll both know how they'll go along, and maybe you know why they'd be attracted to each other. And it's so character driven that it's almost just a case of like, I just have to transcribe it like a journalist rather than actually like invent what happens.
I mean, it sounds woo-woo, but it's like it comes through your fingers. But they're sort of channeling the story onto the page, which is so cool and really fun. I mean, I actually felt more confident and empowered when I wrote the next novel because I had planned it out. And I still liked that I was creative and I took liberties and the characters, told me what to do. But I felt like at least I knew where it was going, so I could skip all of those, middle grounds where, it's messy and it's clunky, and now I need to revise like 12 times or whatever. I still needed to do revising, but not as much, and it wasn't as raw because I had that vision, and it's just empowering. So, I think you can't go wrong with even a light outline. If you don't want to commit to the plotting, just do a little bit of like a one-pager so that you know where you're going.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't know how some people can even write things like mysteries without doing some plotting, because otherwise, I guess you can, but you'd have to do a lot more editing, right? Because you decide something later on, and then I should have sprinkled some clues on throughout the book, and then you got to go back and rewrite it and or fit it all in. But yeah, I mean, some things, maybe romance is a little easier to do more of a pantsing, although you might end up with a character that doesn't have any siblings at the beginning, and then later they have a bunch of siblings.
So I wrote my first book. I had this wonderful bad guy in it, and he had a brother. And then 9 books later, I kind of revisited him and wrote about him being a single child. And then I was like, oh my God. And that's what you need.
That is too funny. Oh my goodness. Yeah, I do think you got to keep track. Definitely.
Yeah. I mean, also have a character book. I think that's something that other people have said, that maybe you have like a folder and you have a page for each of your characters, and it's like eye color, because otherwise you have, your character has green eyes in one book and blue eyes in another book. And even though you're the author and you invented them, it's difficult to keep track of them all.
100%. Yeah, no, and the hair color, the eye color, the way that the physical attributes, but also like their little quirks or something that they do all the time. I find that I'm starting to ascribe the same ones, like you said earlier, to characters again and again. I'm like, well, let me change up the hair color so it's not exactly the same, and you just have things like tendencies, things that you gravitate toward. And I will tell you that when I talk to my daughter about my books, she's 20, and I have 4 kids, but she's the one who's really spent time talking to me about it. She's convinced that every book that I write is the family, like is our family. And so she's like, oh no, that's my dad. And oh no, that's like, honestly, no, like that was not there. But I don't know, maybe it's influenced, who knows? But like I said, you can always read yourself into the situation.
Yeah. And I think, there's a lot of tools out there too that do help with this thing. I mean, Scrivener, I know, allows for all sorts of, being able to build out character sheets and all stuff. But I mean, you can do it without all that. You can do it with simple spreadsheets. You can do it with OneNote. You can do it with all sorts of things. Is there a tool that you use to sort of keep track of everything, or?
I'm so sorry to disappoint, but I am so old-fashioned that Microsoft Word is my friend, and that's just what I do. Everything is a document, and I have a lot of students who use Scrivener, and it's so funny. I've had a few who are like, okay, I'm going to give myself 3 months to learn Scrivener. And I'm like, oh gosh, I don't have the patience for that. So once they do, they're happy in it. But that's a pretty steep learning curve. I don't know if that's been your experience, but I don't know. I just sort of write it all in Word and serves me well.
For me, I have played with Scrivener. I think, like you said, there is a lot of learning there. It is sort of a more in-depth thing. Now I'm sort of more of a OneNote guy who my whole life and everything is in OneNote now. So for writing a book, that it would lend itself pretty easily to that as well. You can create folders on characters and different things, but yeah, it's just, it's really a matter of preference and what you're used to. You don't want to spend too much time learning tools just so you can write your book, so if you know something really well, if you know Word really well, use Word, right? You can do it in Notepad, really. It's just you can have notes everywhere. But yeah, it doesn't really matter. It's just, I was just curious if there was something that you specifically think is better than the rest.
No, I don't. I do think that doing some writing by hand when you're figuring out the characters is important. There's a lot of research that shows that you activate a different part of the brain when you write by hand, a more creative part of the brain than when you're typing. I like to type because I'm impatient and I type really quickly. But when I have done some little prompts just to get to know my characters better by hand, it's amazing what comes out. So I do think sometimes just sitting with a journal or doing certain kinds of, exercises just to get to know your characters and doing it by hand is a richer experience, and you get a lot of great material.
It's interesting. I find by hand, I remember things better.
Yeah.
So if I write myself a note to remind myself of something and I write it by hand, I don't need the note, because I wrote the note, I'm going to remember it now. But if I, type it in the to-do list on my computer, then I might not remember to do it, and I might not even remember to look at the to-do list. So
yeah,
it's like something about writing it by hand activates more memory for me, at least.
Yeah, it's very rich.
Yeah. So what in particular though makes a character more compelling than what makes them sort of like really stick in the reader's minds? What can people do to sort of improve their characterization? A lot of people, they create characters that are, I guess, sort of more flat. Every character is kind of the same, especially when you're starting out writing. Every character is sort of the same as the other one, and they have a different name and they look a little different, but they're all talking kind of in the same voice, or they're all sort of, you can't really tell too much about who one is. When you read a really, really good book that has really rich characterization, you almost don't need any he said, she said business, because you know from what they're saying and the description of them and or like of their speaking patterns, or their or what they're doing as they're talking, you know exactly who it is they're talking about. So how do people sort of create that?
Yeah, and actually Hemingway was really good at that. So there aren't a lot of dialogue tags in his books, and you just know who the characters are. So I think if you think about it, in a lot of novels, there are whiny main characters who are just dissatisfied with their lives, complaining, kind of, fetching, like, oh, my life isn't great. That's sort of boring and annoying because we have that in our lives. And so I think one thing people can strive for is to build strong characters who know themselves. And so what would that look like? And then giving them some interesting or unique pursuits, and also little habits. So, in Woman of Valor, there's a lot of conversation that happens between the married couple when they're doing dishes. Like, that's a thing. Like, she washes and he dries. And so it's just sort of one of their habits that comes back again and again in the book, but it's sort of a foundation for having a good conversation. And so and that's just very ordinary, but I think you could come up with some really different interests. Like, put a character who, wears prairie dresses and cowboy boots on a motorcycle. That doesn't add up, or, somebody who lives in a city but has like a rooftop garden and they're growing like all the herbs for that you can imagine, or something really different that is unexpected in the setting and for the person. Putting so almost oppositional things into one person makes them more interesting. So, they could be soft-spoken, but they could be writing like raunchy erotica or something, and like you don't see that coming. And so I think that's what can make really compelling characters, and also taking the unexpected route. So, when it seems like they're attracted to somebody, outside of the relationship, the natural thing would be like, oh, they're going to go cheat. Well, then don't have them cheat. I just read that in a book recently, and I swear it was set up where I knew, like, actually the couple, the main character was estranged from her husband. So it was like a perfect setting for her to have an affair. And she had this like moral compass that was so strong that she's like, yeah, no, I can't because I'm technically still married. And I'm like, I did not see that coming. And I wanted her to hook up with the guy too. So I think when you don't see it coming, it becomes a more fun read. And that's what makes your characters multidimensional and versatile too.
It's almost like you as an author get to discover the story, and you're right when you talk about it being channeled through you. It's like characters do things because the characters are so strong that you can't make them do things, and they can surprise even you. And that's because they are in your brain real people. Isn't it weird? We writers have real, fully formed characters who could step out of our brains and like exist, and they just live in our heads.
Right. Yeah. You're like, wait, no, that's all made up. Like that actually is not a real place. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if you guys start dreaming about your characters and your book when you're writing it. And then you wake up and you're like, oh yeah, no, that's part of the family. Wait, no, it's not. Like they're not real, but like, it feels like they're there, like they're in your life, in the world, and they're not. So that's weird.
Yeah. If you really immerse yourself in your writing, I think it can take on a lot of different, in your dreams, or you might start, sort of thinking about what people are doing and what the person in the book might do in that situation, right? And I think, that the unexpected path, I think, is a really good way for people to have their characters react. It's not as easy as it sounds, right? Because your natural thought will also be to just take the expected path. You start writing it in that way, and then you realize, okay, well, I'm sort of setting this all up because that's the payoff I'm expecting to do, but then it becomes like too obvious. So you almost have to like think about what your payoff is and then take this roundabout route to get there when you're writing.
Yeah, I think it's really helpful to know the ending, even if the ending is going to change, because like you said earlier, you can then plant little Easter eggs along the way. But you have to know those motivations. And so sometimes I like to envision, what was my character like as a child? And that's never going to show up in this book. But then I can know what they experienced and what their like early years were like to make them the way they are. And so, and if you're a parent, that's even easier to do because my kids are grown now and I can look at them when they were little and say, oh, I saw that back then, but I didn't know I was seeing it. And so when you start to look at your characters that way, as if you are giving birth to them and you're wondering, like, where did they get this tick, or where did they get this tendency? And once you understand that, it can go really, really deep. And that makes them multifaceted.
Yeah. And I think, people also have to be careful, and I've mentioned this sort of in the past as well, where at least for me, I don't love it when a character does something completely out of character, and then it's sort of because they need it as the plot device, and it's like not explained at all, and then they just sort of like backfill the explanation and be like, well, he did that because you never knew it, but he was blah blah blah, and it's like, well, you should at the very least go back and put some little clues in there that make it seem like you're not just making it all up as you go along. Because as an author, like, I get it, you see this a lot, I think, in series that go for a long period of time, where clearly when they started it, like TV, I'm thinking TV series, clearly when they started it, they didn't know that they'd get to season 5 and they'd have all these other things, and then something happens, like that doesn't make sense based on what happened in, you know, season 1 or whatever. But when you're writing, you don't have to worry about that, because you can go back and you can make those edits and add in those little Easter eggs or whatever. And I think that that's something important to do, that authors, you know, you don't want people to feel like someone is acting out of character, and there's really no reason for them to, because you can change that. You can go back and you can edit it so that it is in character.
Yeah.
That's just one thing I don't like when people do. Yeah,
It's interesting, you know, I was on a trip recently in a hotel and was just sort of going through the channels at night, and so Friends was on, and I watched that years ago, so I really know every episode. And it was an early episode, and there was something between Chandler and Monica, and I'm like, okay, did the writers know that in advance that they were going to get them together, or did they get them together because of this in this early episode? You know, it's fascinating to think about, because maybe something comes out early on and you're like, oh, now the story is going in a different direction because of this particular scene or attribute or something. I do think you're right, though, that the job of the author is to go back and revise so that it's tight and cohesive and there's a flow to the story. And I don't know about you guys, but my first drafts are unfortunately very messy. And I know that that's common, but like I keep hoping with each subsequent book that the first drafts are going to be magically amazing, but they're always super messy. And so that's where you sort of have something to work with. Like you can shape it, you can sculpt it, you know, you have something on the page, but it often needs a total reconstruction. And so, you know, yeah, you have the rough stuff, but you still have to shape it.
Yeah,
I don't. Fun fact: for the first half of the first season of Friends, they were thinking of making Chandler gay.
Really, so, like that goes through the whole series, right? You know, that's so funny.
Yeah.
And isn't it funny that, yeah, but there was something that in some way their natural interaction, the two actors, and then that led to what we have now.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So funny. I do look at TV and sometimes movies to see how the characters are developed and where they carry the story through for like educational purposes. And so sometimes I'll look at a series and be like, okay, how would this play out as a book? And even especially ones that are not coming from books, but just to see how do we translate that to the page? How do we make it as vivid and dimensional and descriptive as what we're seeing on the screen? I think they can be great educational tools.
Yeah, for sure. And when people are writing too, they need to really think about everything holistically. And I think a lot of times that's hard to do as well. The idea of, you can pull different characters together. If you look at Friends, right, you have 6 different characters, but they also have to sort of work together. They also have to be a good mesh with each other. And they can't, so it's possible to pull characters together that really won't have the chemistry you need in a book. And so I think it's important that you also think about that, not just, the character individually. You might have these great characters and you want to use them all, but it isn't always possible to use them all in one book, or at least, together in one book. Maybe later you can have a character, but he's just not going to work with these ones here, but maybe later he can be there. I think you have to also think about it sort of as a group as well as individually.
Yeah, I think it's okay to kill off some characters that just are not cutting it for you. And if you love them, save them for another. I think the likelihood of using them is pretty slim, but you never know. It can happen. I always save, because I cut out a really big chunk of a draft, and I think it's just so well written and great. And I save it in a document because I might use it later. I never go back to that document, but you can always do that, and then you never know where it's going to lead you.
And I think it makes you feel better. I think pulling it out is if you at least say to yourself, I might use it later. It's right. So much easier to pull it out than be like, I'm just deleting it. That's much tougher.
I have a big file of like 200,000 words that I call word soup. And it's literally like segments and characters I've taken out, and they just stick them in this word file. Because sometimes you go through and see if there are any gems there. You were talking about Friends, like the 6 characters. 6 is like a magical number. And I think one of the things about Friends is when they started off, they got painted with very broad strokes, but they were naturally characters who clashed against each other. There was super anal retentive Ross who clashed with like super hippie Phoebe. And there was shy, funny Chandler who was kind of clashed against like dumb, super confident Joey. And like the characters drive so much of the story.
Well, that's how you have some, you know, some conflict, and that's what you need to move your story along. Like something has to happen, and if everybody's happy and everything is peachy, then what's your story? And that's not life. I mean, things come up every day, even when you're mostly happy and things are mostly going your way. There's still little things that come up, and that's where the story is. It's in the conflict. It's in the challenge. So you absolutely have to have those oppositional forces.
Yeah, and it's and when I was saying, you know, you might not have characters that work well together, that's not necessarily because they clash, because that actually they probably would work well together. It might be that they're too similar, and thus there's really nothing to say about them at that point. There's no interactions. They're just going to always agree on everything, and where's the fun in that?
Yeah, there has to be something. I mean, so like I said earlier, I don't like whiny characters, but there has to be some misfortune. There has to be something that happens that isn't going the way you want it to go, so that you can overcome it, or you can figure out a solution, or you can grow from it. And that makes depth. So yeah, maybe not whining all the time, but you got to have challenge for sure.
I find that so. I've been thinking a lot about character in relation to like sitcoms and stuff like that. Frasier just did a new reboot, and this is the third generation of Frasier we saw. We saw him when he was 30 in Cheers, then we saw him when he was like 40 in Frasier, and now we see him when he's like 65. And he's a different character from who he was then, except he's also the same character, and it makes it very easy for that show to be so entertaining because you know him, you feel like he's a character, you feel like you know him, and that's when you read a book with a character, you just understand. It's so satisfying.
Yeah.
I wonder too about character growth, and that you know, I feel like there's some times where you get really invested in who a character is, and that really speaks to you, and you really enjoy the story because of that character. But then as the story goes, or maybe as the series goes, the character grows and changes, and sometimes, you know, and that's it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Because characters do grow and change. But I wonder if there's that danger of sort of losing some of what it is that people really gravitated towards, you know, because it has happened to me. I can't think of specific examples, but where, you know, the characters really, I really enjoyed them, but then, you know, they changed throughout the series, and I didn't love the change that they took on. And maybe it was me, maybe other people did, but I guess that's something you kind of also have to think about, because you do want your characters to grow and to change, but you also want to make sure that it's not in a way that is going to sort of turn people off.
Yeah, well,
Joey and Rachel getting together at the end of Friends. There we go, perfect example.
Yeah, that's not a great storyline, right?
Right. Yeah.
Not a fan, but I think that, you know, a story is an arc of transformation. So something has to change, something has to be different from where you started, and there has to be some kind of growth. But I think if the character changes too dramatically, then it's a completely different story, and that's not realistic. Because while people can grow and evolve, at the core, we're pretty much the same for most of our lives. And so your characters need to mirror reality. You know, unless you're writing sci-fi or fantasy, you know, where you can really just go off the page. If you're looking to make it relatable human characters, there's a transformation, but they can't be a completely different character by the end.
So, we are approaching the top of the hour. So, but I had a very important question to ask you, Lynne.
Yep.
Who are your favorite fictional characters from books, from movies, from TV? Who are the ones that like really stand out to you?
Oh my goodness. Well, okay. My favorite lately is Elsa from 1883. Have you guys seen that?
That's that show that was the prequel to Yellowstone, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's the pre-prequel. So there's 1883 and 1923, which are the two prequel seasons to Yellowstone. And Elsa is this amazing 18-year-old on the frontier in 1883, and her voice is the narrator. And then she's actually the narrator in 1923, which is interesting. But she's sort of the matriarch in a way of the family that leads to Yellowstone. And I think her voice is so poetic and sort of, eager, but also in that 18-year-old way that you are, where you just think the world is full of possibility and beauty and love, and it's just so exciting. I think she's probably my favorite character these days.
That's really interesting. Very quickly, Craig, who's your favorite fictional character? Come on.
Oh dear, no, I don't even.
Or a good fictional character, a good one.
I don't know. I think I like sort of like those wise characters that sort of seem to know what's going on when everyone else doesn't. So you think of like a Gandalf in Lord of the Rings, where he's sort of guiding everything and he knows what's happening. And as a writer, that kind of thing always fascinates me, because like it shows, like you almost have to really, really understand your story before you start writing it, to have a character like that who is sort of, or you do a lot of editing, but that really is guiding and pulling things along. So I think I like that kind of a character. What about you, Roland?
He's not necessarily my favorite.
Bond? Is it James Bond?
Well, no, I was going to say one of the most interesting characters I find is Jack Reacher. Because it's like, as you're reading a book and you've read all of these different adventure stories, I love James Bond books and stuff like that. Jack Reacher is 6.5 feet tall, 250 pounds. He just has no fear and no insecurities. And I think so many men are plagued by insecurities, and we do feel like, you're physically vulnerable. And so to read about this story about this guy who, he walks into a room, every single pair of eyes will turn on him. He talks to somebody, they'll be intimidated. I mean, to me, that's great characterization, because you put him into a situation and you kind of know how the situation will unfold, because he's such a strong character, even though it's quite simple. And that's why you can just keep reading the 25 books of him.
Yeah.
So I love that. I want to say also, a favorite character who's not in a book, who's a real person of mine, is David Beckham, because he defies expectation for me. Like, he's so unique and original and just isn't what you think he will be based on his role. And I think that's really cool. So
I had the biggest belly laugh ever from David Beckham when they had that show with him and Victoria, and Victoria was going on about how she came from such a working class background and poor background. And he just poked his head around the door and goes, "Tell him what car you drove to school in." And it was a Rolls Royce. It was just like the way he just called his own wife out on her pretentious. I was just beautiful.
Yeah. So maybe I'll write a character like him one day.
Absolutely. Well, we are coming up to the top of the hour. So, Lynn, where can people find out more about you? Where can they go?
So I'm everywhere. You can find me on social media. My website's lynnegolodner.com, and I write, I think, a pretty good Substack every Monday, so you could find me there too. And just say hello. Tell me that you heard me here. I'd love it.
Excellent. Well, we'll pop a link down below. And while you are listening to this, if you want to go and check out that link, that's great. But also, why don't you leave Lynn a comment? Let her know and let us know how much you appreciated everything she had to say here today. And also, while you're down there, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, and we'll be back next week with another episode of Fully Booked. So until then, thank you very much for joining us. Bye-bye.